Asian Studies, and it's a delight to welcome you all here tonight. In partnership with the University of Chicago Library, the CEAS Lecture Series is an initiative that advances the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies mission in fostering dialogue and interdisciplinary collaboration. I think we need to turn the mic down just a bit. It's like ringing. This annual series presents eminent scholars who concentrate on the study of East Asia in a variety of disciplines. Tonight's lecture is also co-sponsored with the Department of Cinema and Media Studies, and as I said, with the University of Chicago Library, and we thank them. For more information on our series and who's speaking this year, visit the check-in table in the foyer and scan the QR code, which will take you to our series webpage. Our next speaker will feature Yao-Chang, professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark. His lecture, A Fractured Liberation, Korea Under U.S. Occupation, will be delivered Wednesday, November 12th, here in this room at 5 p.m. Please register to attend. Tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be placed online for public viewing, so if you're interested in sharing it once it's published, we welcome you to visit our YouTube page where you can see many events that have been recorded. So now I'd like to pass it on to Professor Daniel Morgan, who will be introducing our speaker tonight. Daniel Morgan is Professor of Cinema and Media Studies here at the University of Chicago. He's the author of Late Godard and the Possibilities of Cinema and The Lure of the Image, Epistemic Fantasies of the Moving Camera, and has edited multiple volumes and special issues of journals. He's currently completing a short book on Robert Bresson's last films and the topic of political despair. So welcome, Professor Morgan.
Thanks, Chelsea. Oh, this is loud. Thanks, Chelsea. It's an honor for me to be able to be here tonight. It's also a little odd. My specialty is not in East Asian cinema. Jason, before the talk, said in aside to Michael that he had put in some facts about Taiwan, so in case people here didn't know, and Michael looked at me and said, "That's for you." I said, okay, it's not that bad. But anyway, it's an honor to be in this venue and with this audience introducing Jason. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Jason McGrath to Chicago as part of the CEAS lecture series. He is professor in Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. I have known Jason for about as long as I have had any connection to the field of cinema and media studies. I believe I got to know him my first fall as a graduate student when he was an advanced graduate student here at the University of Chicago. Both of us were here. I was just starting out and sort of in the world of discovering new things about the university and the universe. And I had, of course, known something about Chinese cinema, but it was really like based on more familiar art house fare of both fifth-generation filmmakers and new Taiwanese cinema. And Jason was central in introducing me to two major trends of contemporary or then contemporary Chinese language filmmaking. One was the urban or sixth generation, especially the films of Jie Zhengke, which you gave me, Jason, on a series of VCDs to go back into the media archaeology. And Jason would come back from his research trips in China and just show off, like, look at the box of VCDs I got. Black market, all of them, but they're great. But more importantly, and I say more importantly because, I was young and less inexperienced, more inexperienced than I am now, but even though I'm still inexperienced in this area, I would have eventually discovered those films on my own, I think, pretty sure. But more important then was his introduction to me of more popular mainland filmmaking, directors like Fang Zhougang, and filmmakers who were then not making art house films, but making, big budget films like Big Shot's Funeral, which I think I've recommended or enthused about to more people in this room than I want to consider, because I remember still Jason showing it to me, go, "You've got to see this. This is hilarious. This is wonderful. This is a great account of what's going on." Now, Jason's work on these films, both the Sixth Generation films and also the mainland Chinese films of Feng Zhigang and others, form the core of his first book, Post-Socialist Modernity, Chinese Cinema, Literature, and Criticism in the Market Age. At a very basic level, it's a book that's an account of the state of Chinese culture after the turn to a market economy. But it has, as with all of Jason's work, both a deep focus on the particular, but also a broader account of why this particular example matters. Not that it isn't sufficient to matter to rethink how Chinese literature and cinema work, but he was able to extract from the case of China after the turn to a market economy a broader theory of post-socialism as a global condition, both a set of countries that had shifted economic formations, but a broader condition of being at the end of the alternative to capitalism. So Fukuyama without the end of history. It's an exemplary work as well of criticism, of showing how film and literature are not only shaped by changing conditions, market trends, institutional supports, and so on, but also how these works reflect back on those structures, even in its most popular forms. That is, post-socialist modernity combines social criticism with formal analysis, and a sense of the place of Chinese film and literature within the trends of international art and literature. Now, beyond that, he then published a range of essays on a wide variety of topics, including one of my favorite titles, Communists Have More Fun. Take that, post-socialism. More recently, he published the extraordinary book, Chinese Film Realism and Convention from the Silent Era to the Digital Age in 2022. Is that right? It's 22, right? Yeah. He, in the book, somewhat modestly describes his project as an attempt to tell a history of Chinese cinema through the lens of realism. And that's true. And the insights he gets from that are deep and profound and change the kind of basic account we have of this history. But it's so much more than that. I think, for example, of the amazing analysis of the role of the gaze in Maoist cinema, weaving together revolutionary romanticism, socialist policy, and Laura Mulvey, three phrases that rarely go together, to generate a beautiful and compelling analysis of what he calls the socialist realist gaze, a critical concept, but also a generative one, getting at the formal operations of films for whom form is so rarely central to their account. His presentation today, though, is on something different, reckoning with the settler-colonial paradox on Taiwan public television. I'm looking forward to seeing what this project, how this project develops and what insights Jason has to offer. So please join me in welcoming Jason McGrath to the University of Chicago.
Thank you so much. It's kind of odd to hear me described as a senior grad student when Dan was a junior, because my memory of that time was that I was trying to grapple with filmmakers like Yao-Chang, and I would turn to Dan constantly for advice about what I should read of film theory that would help me make sense of it, and got a great deal of my film education from talking to him, as well as, of course, Tom Gunning, who was on my committee, and people like Miriam Hansen. So I owe so much to Chicago for my career. I'd like to thank the Center for East Asian Studies, glad it's still around. The Department of, we lost ours, the Department of Cinema and Media Studies, the University of Chicago Library, all of who co-sponsored this. Thanks to Dan and Tom Lamar and Lillian Kong for doing a lot to make this happen. And special thanks to Hyunjin Schubert and Connie Yip for all the help with logistics as well. So my talk today centers on the 12-episode television series Sekalu Formosa 1867, which aired on Taiwan Public Television in 2021 and is available streaming on Netflix in Taiwan and on the government-sponsored Taiwan Plus streaming service throughout the world with English subtitles. You can easily watch it. I aim to show how the series along with the 2016 historical novel on which it was based, relates to contemporary Taiwanese nationalism, which is to say the assertion of Taiwan as a sovereign nation-state separate from China, and how in the process it mediates resulting contradictions relating to indigeneity and settler colonialism. One of my central assertions is that it is precisely when Taiwan asserts its independence that it is forced to reckon one way or another with being a settler colonial state. To make these arguments understandable to those without a detailed knowledge of Taiwan's population and history, I'll begin with some basic facts about the island nation, which is technically one main island and dozens of smaller ones currently under the control of the Republic of China, which remains the official name of the territory. The main island of Taiwan, which was named Ilha Formosa, or Beautiful Island, by the Portuguese sailors in the 16th century, was populated by dozens of different Austronesian tribal peoples for the 6,000 or so years before the Dutch tried to colonize it in the 17th century. It was the Dutch who facilitated the large-scale migration of Han Chinese, the ethnicity that makes up more than 90% of the Chinese population, from southern China to Taiwan for mainly agricultural labor. These Han settlers consisted largely of so-called Hoklo people from Fujian province, right across the strait, speakers of the Hokkien or Minnan language, now simply called Taiwanese in Taiwan, and Hakka or Keja people from Guangzhou province who spoke their own Hakka language. The island became a Chinese territory only after it served briefly as a Ming loyalist base after the fall of the Ming dynasty, making it a threat for the Qing dynasty to subdue. However, it's important to note that from Taiwan's annexation by the Qing in 1683 up until its ceding to Japan as a colony more than 200 years later, the Qing Empire never actually exercised sovereignty throughout the island, as most of the mountainous regions in the eastern half of the island were still populated by indigenous tribes, which traded with the Chinese in the western part of the island, but never were forced to accede to Qing rule in their own territory. During this same period, however, the Hoklo and Hakka Han settlers became a majority of the island's overall population. After Japan's defeat in World War II and Taiwan's subsequent return to the Republic of China, the existing Hoklo and Hakka settler population were joined by the fleeing nationalists or Kuomintang, KMT, government, along with what was left of its army and various refugees. These people and their descendants are called Waishengren, or people from other provinces in Mandarin in Taiwan, or simply mainlanders in English, to distinguish them from Bunshengren, or people from this province, or simply Taiwanese, which includes all the people in Taiwan whose ancestors were already there before 1945. The breakdown of the population of Taiwan today is approximately 70% Hoklo Han Chinese, 12 to 15% Hakka Han Chinese, and 12% so-called mainlanders who arrived after 1945. The indigenous peoples who populated the entire island before the 17th century are now no more than 2.5% of the population. That's comparable to the percent of the population who are Native, First Nations, or Aboriginal in the US, Canada, and Australia, respectively. The percentages there range from 2.9% to 5%. All those are quintessential settler-colonial societies in which the descendants of settlers far outnumber the descendants of indigenous people. Does that make Taiwan a settler-colonial society? From the perspective of the People's Republic of China, which still claims Taiwan as a Chinese province, temporarily controlled by a US puppet regime, the answer is definitely no. Sorry, somehow my slides are doubling. If you look at a map of the 55 officially recognized ethnic minority groups in China, you see that one of them is the so-called Gaoshan, or High Mountain people of Taiwan, sometimes called the Formosan ethnic minority. It's worth noting that this constitutes a dramatic lumping together of many different tribes with different languages and cultures. So this is a map of what we think is the approximate geographical distributions of Formosan Aboriginal peoples before colonization. So there are at least 24 distinct tribes, distinct cultures, distinct languages. This is a map of the families of Formosan languages before colonization, and these are Austronesian languages that linguists have shown their relation to, for example, languages in the Philippines or Malaysia. So, in any case, that grouping of all the indigenous tribes of Taiwan, there it is, that grouping of all the indigenous tribes of Taiwan as one Chinese ethnic minority in that grouping of all the indigenous tribes of Taiwan as one Chinese ethnic minority, the growth of the Han Chinese population to become the vast majority of the population in Taiwan is, in that case, merely a matter of internal migration, not the establishing of a separate settler-colonial state. In other words, the ethnic minority is still there and the Han Chinese migrated there, but they're all Chinese because these 55 ethnic minorities are all considered Chinese. It's precisely in that sense that Taiwan becomes settler colonial only when it asserts its sovereignty as an independent nation state. And that is also precisely when the contradictions intrinsic to settler colonialism become ideological problems to be resolved in the formation of Taiwanese nationalism. This, I argue, is the fundamental agenda of the Sekalu television series. Before turning to my analysis of the TV show and its source novel, I'll briefly take a detour through theories of settler colonialism and its paradoxes. In his 2010 book, Settler-Colonialism, A Theoretical Overview, Lorenzo Veracini outlines the peculiarities of settler colonialism as distinct from colonialism in general. Veracini begins with George Ballandé's seminal definition of the colonial situation as the domination imposed by a foreign minority, racially or ethnically and culturally different, acting in the name of a racial or ethnic and cultural superiority dogmatically affirmed and imposing itself on an indigenous population constituting a numerical majority but inferior to the dominant group from a material point of view. This is a description that well describes, for example, Indonesia under Dutch rule or the Philippines under Spanish and then American rule. It also describes Taiwan as a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945, or even Taiwan as subject to domination by the newly arrived mainlanders for many decades after the departure of the Japanese, the two ways in which Taiwan has most often been analyzed as post-colonial in scholarship until recently. However, Veracini points out that Ballandé's definition of the colonial situation is entirely inadequate for coming to terms with settler colonialism. After all, strictly following a definition of colonialism as a minority from elsewhere dominating an indigenous majority, as soon as the outside settlers reach majority status in a territory, they no longer fit the definition of colonizers, and as soon as the indigenous population becomes a minority, they are no longer colonized, which is obviously nonsensical. Instead, Veracini points out what is distinctive about settler colonies is that the colonizers not only become the majority, but they lay claim to autonomy from their original homeland. Thus, the classic settler colonies of British imperialism, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all not only became majority white, but also eventually claimed sovereignties autonomous from Great Britain. To justify both settler dominance over indigenous peoples, and autonomy from the original colonizing homeland. As Anna Johnston and Alan Lawson detail, the settler colony has to simultaneously desire and disavow two kinds of authority and authenticity. First, the settler asserts the authority and authenticity of the ostensibly more civilized motherland vis-a-vis the indigenous population, justifying the colonization itself, in this case, the Han settlement of Taiwan. At the same time, however, the settler eventually claims the authenticity of indigeneity to give it the authority to assert independence from the same motherland, which is the case with contemporary Taiwanese nationalism. Thus, it is precisely insofar as Taiwan asserts its independence from China and becomes explicitly a settler-colonial society that it has to reconcile the two impulses regarding indigeneity. Johnson and Lawson emphasize that it is through cultural representation that the settlers and settler-colonial societies, as opposed to colonial sojourners in non-settler colonies whose identities still derive more fully from the metropole, begin to refer to themselves and their culture as indigenous, their sense of belonging enabled by new cultural forms that assert a novel native identity, such as American pioneers or cowboys, Argentinian gauchos, Canadian Mounties, or Australian Bushmen. In Taiwan today, the claim of indigeneity for Taiwanese people in general has been explicitly tied to biological genetics. Instead of the KMT or nationalists, as well as CCP, Chinese Communist Party, narrative of everyone in Taiwan of every ethnicity being Chinese, as Taiwan-based scholar of indigeneity P. Karam Friedman puts it, quote, a major transformation had taken place by the late 1990s, with many Taiwanese proudly citing studies showing that most Han Taiwanese have some indigenous DNA. A leader in that genetically based claim of Taiwaneseness has been Yao-Chang, a doctor, medical researcher, and former legislator representing the pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party. Dr. Chen, well known for his espousal of Taiwan as the ancestral homeland of all Austronesian people and of even Han people in Taiwan as genetically distinct from mainland Chinese, became in addition a writer of historical novels, one of which, Kuilei Hua, or Puppet Flower, became the basis for the Sikalu TV series. An English translation of the novel was published by Columbia University Press as Puppet Flower, a novel of 1867 Formosa. The novel is the basis for the later public television show, and both deploy various tropes to reinforce a sense of collective Taiwanese identity that overcomes the contradictions of settler colonialism, including not just settler versus indigenous, but also the paradoxical need of the settlers to claim indigeneity for themselves. I will describe various of these tropes as they played out both in prose and then distinctively in the moving image, concluding with particular attention to how a single, entirely fictional character, taking her place among several main characters based on actual historical figures, anchors the story and plays the most crucial role in carrying out its ideological work in the service of Taiwanese nationalism. A real historical incident in 1867 is what the incident that the novel and the TV show were based on, and that was the wreck of the American merchant ship Rover just off the southern tip of Taiwan, an event that set off an international incident after most of its surviving crew, including the captain and his wife, were immediately murdered by local mountain aborigines to avenge a much earlier slaughter of a large number of their tribal ancestors by Westerners arriving on Taiwan's shores. The American envoy based in Xiamen, or Amoy, in South China, Charles Legendre, went to Taiwan to investigate and to demand justice from the Qing authorities. He was assisted by the British sojourner William Pickering, an old Taiwan hand with functional ability in multiple Sinophone languages, whose memoir, Pioneering in Formosa, Recollections of Adventures Among Mandarins, Wreckers, and Headhunting Savages, is still in print today. Eventually, a Qing military force was deployed to South Taiwan to potentially make war with the offending indigenous tribe to satisfy the Americans, but instead diplomatic efforts among Legendre, Pickering, and the Aboriginal tribal chief called Tokitok in the series, Zhuoqidu in Chinese, resulted in a peace treaty that ended the crisis and ensured that shipwrecked white people would henceforth be treated humanely. So that's all real history that inspired the novel and the series. All of these actual historical figures and others, such as a British doctor and researcher in Taiwan named Patrick Manson, the Qing dynasty general Liu Mingdeng, and the local Hakka leader Lin Ajiu, appear as characters in the novel and through multiple episodes of the TV series. And you see there both the actors in the TV series and, when I could find it, the actual photos. I couldn't find a photo of Lin Ajiu, maybe there isn't one, but the others were actual figures. In contrast, the central protagonist, called Butterfly in the English translation of the novel, and Diame, or Tiapmo, in the TV series, a young woman whose father was Hakka, but whose mother was a princess in Tokitok's tribe of mountain aborigines, is entirely fictional and entirely aimed to serve as a kind of founding icon of a Taiwanese identity that is inclusive of aborigines and settlers, but exclusive of China. A character turned, in the case of the TV show, into a sacrificial virgin martyr for the new nation. Before breaking down the depiction of Butterfly, we can first discuss the closely related imagining of Formosa as a landscape of primordial beauty, rich with native flora and fauna that encourage affective investment by the reader or viewer. The novel is replete with descriptions of Taiwan's beauty, often observed through the eyes of the novel's multiple Western characters. Formosa is a beautiful island worthy of its name. It is not only beautiful, but also bountiful. Its landscape exceeds description. It will be a precious gem in Asia, and so on. Those descriptions come from 3 different British characters in the novel. In the television show, aerial landscape cinematography and computer-generated imagery, CGI, periodically lend a sublime overview or magical realist overlay to the representation of Taiwan's land and its natural inhabitants. They appear on occasion throughout the 12 episodes of the show, but here I will focus on the key opening and closing sequences of the entire series to show how crucial they are in mobilizing viewers' affective investments in both the show's characters and the distinctive Taiwanese identity that the show encourages viewers to imagine. The first sequence of episode 1 of the series establishes the iconography that becomes strongly attached both to Butterfly's and Taiwan's identity. The opening shots show Butterfly walking along a mountain stream and seeing a vision of her dead mother. That's followed by an aerial drone shot of the rainforest that is her ancestral home. After the aerial shot, we see a swarm of CGI butterflies, which are associated in the series not only with Butterfly herself, but with the spirit of her mother. Just over a minute later, there is another sequence of 3 shots that introduce more of the series' key motifs. A mountain tribe gathers with a striking geological feature looming on the near horizon, which is followed by another aerial shot, one that will be repeated later in the series, circling the same peak. This cuts to an aerial tracking shot following a herd of over 40 Formosan Sika deer. Together, these shots in the opening minutes of the series create metonymic as well as metaphoric connections among these key motifs. The geological feature in the two shots shown near the beginning of episode 1, the first with the tribe members gathered in the foreground and the second a circling aerial shot, is Mount Dajianshi, called Turtle Nose Mountain in the novel, today a sightseeing destination in what is now Kunding National Park on the southern tip of Taiwan. CGI enhancement has removed all markers of contemporary human habitation, like you see here in the two tourist photos on the lower left, to lend it a primordial pre-colonial look. Multiple shots in the series connect this particular mountain to the mountain Aboriginal tribal grouping that gives the series its name, CEAS, and takes Turtle Nose Mountain as a sacred place. The site thus comes to embody both Taiwan's natural beauty and its indigenous heritage. Aerial shots, such as the repeated one of Mount Dajianshi, cannot help but recall the award-winning 2013 film Beyond Beauty, Taiwan from Above, called simply Seeing Taiwan in Chinese, Kanjian Taiwan, an eco-critical documentary by director Qi Bolin, produced by Ho Xiaoxian, the famous filmmaker, and narrated by frequent Ho collaborator Wu Nianzhen, which broke the box office record for a domestically produced documentary in Taiwan and is credited with pressuring the government to face Taiwan's environmental problems. That documentary's footage was comprised entirely of aerial shots from a helicopter, and one shot of Mount Dajianshi near the beginning of the film seems to be almost replicated by the repeated iconic shot in the Sakalu series, albeit from a higher altitude. Beyond Beauty, Taiwan from Above is separated into 3 parts. The first part devoted to such aerial shots of natural beauty, the longer middle section documenting environmental destruction on the island, and a shorter section at the end providing more upbeat hints at solutions to such problems while also invoking Taiwan's indigenous heritage. As Chiu Gui-fen has noted in an article on Taiwanese eco-documentaries, the film's strength lies in its generation of affect, in particular audience identification with the land through an eco-sublime aesthetic. Clearly, the aerial shots in Sekalu aspire to the same so-called impact aesthetic of the eco-sublime and are likely directly inspired by the popular documentary film. The Formosan Sika deer, obviously rendered by CGI each time it makes its appearance in the series, also bears heavy symbolic weight. The subspecies is endemic to Taiwan and for thousands of years densely populated the western lowlands of the island from north to south. Beginning in the 17th century, millions of the animals were hunted and killed as Dutch and Chinese traders exploited markets for deer hides in mainland China and Japan. In addition, agriculture and urbanization eventually claimed most of the deer's habitat, to the point that finally the last known Sika deer on the island was killed in the wild, was killed in 1969. A small captive population remained in zoos, however, and the deer have been gradually reintroduced to Kunding National Park, precisely where Mount Dajianshi is located and where many of the events of Sekalu occur. Today, the wild population is estimated to exceed 1,000, with hopes that such a successful reintroduction could be repeated elsewhere in Taiwan. The Formosan Sika deer has long served to represent Taiwanese identity in the face of outside aggression. For example, in the strange and delightful 1961 Taiwanese dialect film, The Fantasy of the Deer Warrior, highly recommended, often interpreted as an allegory of the threat to Taiwanese from communist China, or perhaps clandestinely even from the nationalist occupiers who arrived in 1949, in which the attractive and kind-hearted deer, played by humans in animal costumes, must fight off a pair of murderous invading wolves. Sika deer had also appeared in Beyond Beauty, Taiwan from Above, the eco-critical documentary. A side-by-side comparison shows another possible debt of Sekalu's images to the earlier documentary, but also highlights the computer animation of the fauna in the later show compared to the documentary's real animals. Finally, the CGI butterflies that are first seen in the opening shots of the first episode will return at key moments in the series. In episode 4, Butterfly and her brother visit their mother's grave, and a swarm of fluttering butterflies suddenly appears all around them as Butterfly addresses her mother's spirit. "Mother knows your back," observes her brother, and even the American envoy who employs Butterfly as a guide and interpreter and kind of a servant, Legendre, prays to the mother's spirit later in the scene. The CGI-generated Taiwanese fauna motifs return most forcefully and connect to the crucial character Butterfly most closely in the latter's death scene in the show's final episode. Having helped to successfully negotiate the peace treaty between the mountain Aborigines and the Western powers seeking to protect future shipwrecked sailors, Butterfly has changed into the indigenous tribal clothing that both she and her mother had been wearing in the opening sequence of episode 1 shown earlier. After visiting her mother's gravestone and telling her mother, "Mother, I've returned to our land," she walks in a shallow stream in the mountains, stops to take a drink of water, and suddenly is ambushed and shot twice by Han Chinese, recognizable by the Qing dynasty enforced pigtails in their hair. Prone on her back and dying, Butterfly is again surrounded by a swarm of fluttering CGI butterflies, her outstretched hand briefly serving as a perch for one of them. "Mother," she says before closing her eyes and dying, while an especially large, beautiful CGI deer with flowers in its antlers comes to the stream bank to sniff her and see her off to join her ancestors. Since Butterfly had been the series' protagonist and point of view character for the audience from the beginning, this scene, lifted to a transcendent level by magical realist CGI, is very affecting, likely to induce tears to anyone who has watched the entire series. Aside from facilitating diplomacy through her multilingualism and the trust she has earned from both Legendre and Tokitok, the Aboriginal chief, Butterfly functions most importantly as an embodiment of Taiwanese identity, connecting through her own hybridity the indigenous inhabitants of the island with the Han settlers. She is, in the words of author Yao-Chang himself in his preface to the English edition of the novel, an avatar of Taiwan, whose role has what he calls supreme significance, even though, or perhaps more accurately because, she is the only one of the show's main characters who is entirely fictional. If anything, Butterfly's role is even more crucial in the TV series based on Chun's novel, for it is only in the latter telling of the story that she becomes a martyred sacrificial virgin bordering on being an object of worship in the concluding episode of the series. In the novel, Butterfly is creepily ogled by Legendre, the American envoy, from their first meeting, and in fact is eventually raped by him on the very night before he goes to the crucial peace treaty council with Tokitok. The novel does not have her even present at the treaty council with him, whereas in the television show, she plays a crucial mediating role and certainly is not raped the night before. In the novel, after the brutal rape by Legendre, she hates him passionately and eventually marries her Plains Aboriginal half-breed companion, Chinya or Songzi. By the novel's epilogue, she has birthed a child and become a successful folk doctor based on her earlier training by Dr. Manson. In the television series, the storyline of her medical training is mostly dropped. Legendre's fondness for her is cast as more paternal than carnal, and she dies rather than settling into a satisfying family and professional life. The series ends with a coda set 2 years later when Legendre, Pickering, and Dr. Mason visit an ailing Chief Tokitok near the end of his life and then visit Butterfly's grave. The nearly 11-hour series ends with a reflection on Butterfly's significance, accompanied by the now familiar CGI, fauna, and aerial cinematography. So let's watch the end together, beginning with the visit to Butterfly's grave.
I returned to see you once more. Servant. My friend. Russian princess. My dear Lily. God. Feels just like yesterday that she was still here with us. Who could have done this? It was us. We did it. I tell myself that she's at peace now. Beautiful mountains. The beautiful lands that she calls home.
Oh, she is there. Believe me.
So, sorry for the spoilers, but that's the end of the entire series. So after the emotional visit to her grave, walking on Taiwan's hilly plains with several Chinese porters, the key foreigners Pickering, Legendre, and Dr. Manson reminisce about the dear young friend they have lost, concluding that she is at peace now in the beautiful mountains and the beautiful lands that she calls home. The show cuts away from the men to an aerial drone shot that sweeps across the pristine landscape with multiple groups of CGI deer visible on the plains below. The aerial shot then cuts to another view of Mount Dajianshi, in front of which two CGI deer with flowers in their antlers pose, first in a closer shot and then at a longer distance. Following their pose, as if having bid the audience goodbye, the deer turn and walk away over a ridge, whereupon the series concludes with the exact same circling aerial shot of Mount Dajianshi that had appeared in the opening minutes of episode 1. After the final image, the series is explicitly dedicated to Taiwan. Remarkably, throughout the sequence and continuing from the previous scene at Butterfly's grave 2 years actually, that's not 2 years earlier. The soundtrack surges with the melody of the Christian hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. So there's much to unpack here. First, why end with a Christian hymn? To us, it may seem out of place in a series to have an ending celebrating the indigenous heroine of the story and end with a Christian hymn. In fact, however, it's far from surprising given the fact that while only approximately 6% of Taiwan's population is Christian, due to centuries of missionary activity, including services such as health clinics, schools, and orphanages, fully 70% of the indigenous people of Taiwan today are Christian. The Christian theme also reinforces the image of Butterfly as a sacrificial martyr. When Pickering asks, referring to Butterfly's murder, who could have done this, Legendre answers, as if paraphrasing Mick Jagger's line about who killed the Kennedys in Sympathy for the Devil, it was us, we did it. Butterfly thus metaphorically is martyred in the service of peace, not just peace between the indigenous peoples, the Americans, and the Qing army, but perhaps more importantly in the service of unity in Taiwan's ethnic diversity, painstakingly depicted throughout the series and consisting to this day of a mix of Hakka and Hoklo Han Chinese, as well as the pre-existing indigenous people and even the newly arrived mainland settlers of the 20th century. As a half Han, half indigenous Formosan princess, Butterfly represents the ideal of a Taiwanese people whose newly claimed shared indigenous ancestry, given the imprimatur of scientific truth by figures such as the genetic scientist doctor who wrote Puppet Flower, marks them as a separate people from China deserving their own state. At the same time, somewhat ironically, the virgin martyr figure cannot help but draw additional affective power from the longstanding Chinese tradition of celebrating chastity martyrs and exemplary women, lianyu, so that the assertion of a distinctively Taiwanese identity contains echoes of Chinese Confucian ideology. As mentioned earlier, the novel Puppet Flower and the television series based on it were made under the auspices of the pro-independence pan-green political coalition led by the Democratic Progressive Party, which has controlled the executive branch of the government continuously for nearly a decade now. So it's no surprise that public television would offer works that help to build the image of a sovereign Taiwan identity. The show was considered a sensation that attracted wide attention. Some complained that the plot was too complex and the characters and ethnic groups too numerous to follow, while others critiqued its historical veracity. Even the generally pro-KMT major newspapers, such as the China Times and United Daily News, published thoughtful discussions that were not mainly negative, but some reactions followed upon predictable political biases. The Taipei Chinese publication The Observer accused it of historical distortion and an agenda of de-Sinicization, critiqued its negative portrayal of the Qing general Liu Mingde, whom it called truly a national hero, and insisted that the Puppet Flower author Chen Yao-Chang had a complete ignorance of the historical period he wrote about. The main pro-independence newspaper, Liberty Times, meanwhile, published an approving review that concluded, "We hope that more works will allow us to engage with the history of Taiwan's diverse ethnic groups, establish a narrative unique to Taiwan, and move towards a truly harmonious society where all ethnic groups coexist and thrive." Quite aside from the politically motivated pan-green praise or criticisms relating to pan-blue political views supporting a fundamental Chinese identity for Taiwan, my discussion suggests that we must acknowledge the problematic aspects of the show and the ideas that inform it. The urge to claim a genetic distinction between Han people in Taiwan and the same ethnicity in mainland China obviously entails all the dangers involved with basing national identity on a claim of eugenics. It also invites the same sorts of critiques that, for example, indigenous Mexicans have raised about the overstating of mestizo identity to claim indigeneity for all or most Mexicans. As indigenous activists and scholars have pointed out, many of those eager to claim indigeneity today, in fact, do not come from communities that have suffered the hundreds of years of prejudice and discrimination that actual indigenous communities have suffered. Veracini notes that in settler-colonial narratives, in the process of establishing autonomy, the indigenous other can act as a fetish for the settler, whose identity is intrinsically ambivalent due to the simultaneous desires to both disavow and become the native. In the novel Puppet Flower, and especially the TV show Sekalu, the central character Butterfly appears as an externalization of the desire to connect with a Taiwanese-ness that is inclusive but still primordial, reconciling the authority of the settler with the authenticity of indigeneity, and thus empowering the settler to assert an identity separate from the homeland. As a genetically mixed medium between indigenous and Han identities, Butterfly offers the possibility for all to participate in a collective Formosan subjectivity. She is, after all, both Hakka and a Formosan princess. In the TV show, she becomes not just a fetish, but a martyr as well, a virgin sacrifice who dies for the sins of the settlers while giving them access to the authenticity of indigeneity. All Taiwanese symbolically are descendants of Butterfly, the martyred Formosan princess, providing what Melissa Brown has called a Taiwanese narrative of unfolding, a selective narration of the history of a people as an inevitable unfolding of destiny that thereby posits a distinct nation. Such a narrative reconciles the settler-colonial paradox, which becomes apparent precisely when Taiwan becomes its own nation state. So I'll conclude with an acknowledgement of the controversy concerning the very term settler-colonial, both in reference to Taiwan and more generally. When I gave a shorter version of this talk at a liberal arts college, a faculty member from Taiwan disagreed vehemently with the idea that Taiwan should be lumped in with nations such as the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as a settler-colonial society. The argument was essentially that it oversimplifies Taiwan's history, including the fact that its settlers were largely poor Chinese hundreds of years ago seeking opportunities to make a living, not privileged imperialists establishing colonies, and that centuries of intermarriage have meant that the distinction between settler and native is not so clear anyway. All this is true, but it's also true that the farmers and laborers who settled Minnesota, Illinois, or Australia for that matter, were largely people of little wealth seeking opportunities they could not find in their home countries, and that intermarriage and mixed blood descendants of both settlers and natives were common in those societies. As mentioned briefly earlier, until recently, terms such as colonialism and post-colonialism were mainly applied to Taiwan to refer to the period of Japanese occupation or the transference of the KMT seat of government from Nanjing to Taipei and subsequent white terror after the nationalists lost the Civil War, or even to the status of Taiwan as an American military outpost during the Cold War. Only recently have some scholars, including Veracini himself, the theorists of settler colonialism referred to earlier, begun to analyze Taiwan as fundamentally a settler colonial society. Perhaps most prominently in the field of Taiwan studies, Shumei Shi has unambiguously described Taiwan's status as, quote, a settler colony where indigenous Austronesian peoples have been colonized for several hundred years and yet endured, as an a priori fact that precedes all ways of understanding Taiwan's history and presents us with the imperative of settler colonial critique. My own analysis of Puppet Flower and Sikalu, which will be submitted to a special issue of Taiwan Lit on indigeneity in Taiwan, can be thought of as a response to her call. Another more general argument against the concept of settler colonialism grows from the notion that it immediately implies an ethical judgment against the descendants of settlers and a possible ethical imperative of a decolonization consisting of the actual removal or even eradication of the so-called settlers. As a recent article in Dissent magazine puts it, critics fear the term implies that, quote, the scales of justice can only be made right by removing those excoriated as settlers. Recently, of course, this fear has been most noticeable in the discussions of Israel and Palestine. However, as the author goes on to argue, the concept of settler colonialism should be measured as an analytical tool rather than an accusation of guilt against descendants of settlers. In that case, the ethical imperative of decolonization need not involve the removal of these so-called settlers, which, whether in Taiwan or in America, is in any case a farcical non-starter. What it does connote, however, ethically and politically, is a recognition of history and a commitment to acknowledging and seeking to redress the wrongs of the past, as well as a measure of restraint in claiming the authenticity of indigeneity for a majority population that in actual fact has benefited materially and otherwise from the advantages of settler colonialism, while indigenous peoples have struggled mightily just to survive. And in many cases, including those of Taiwan's so-called Plains Aborigines, whose languages and cultures have effectively already vanished, failed to survive, whether due to genocide or the overwhelming forces of assimilation. The Sikalu phenomenon thus marks a significant stage in the emergence of a sovereign Taiwanese identity, while also calling for caution about some of its implicit claims. Okay, and I look forward to questions, discussions, comments.